Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Seed Butter channel. I'm grateful you're spending tonight with me, and I hope that in the next hour or so, I'll manage to terrify, perplex, and entertain. This video has been a very long time coming, and for that, I apologize. This idea has sat in limbo, scattered across my desktop for months, mainly because the plan was to initially have a full cast of voice actors helping out, which was more difficult than I anticipated. That, alongside some other difficulties, ultimately led to this coming out when it did, and though it's not the full audiobook-esque production I would have liked it to have been, I am absolutely still positive that you will love this video. I'll also have to apologize for my mic quality. I don't have much to work with, as I don't yet have a permanent, or even semi-permanent work setup right now, so do bear with me, and it will get better in the future. Today, I'll be reading and analyzing not just one short story, but a 4-part series which I've come to call the BLIT Saga, containing BLIT from 1988, and 3 sequels published from then on up until the year 2000. These were written by David Lanford, a British author, critic, publisher, and editor who is very active in the field of sci-fi literature, and who has published quite a number of short stories in his time. These stories are not only gripping, but they laid the foundation for the concept of a cognitohazard, and things like SCP stories or even the entire concept of Roko's basilisk. In fact, with SCPs in particular, we'll talk about how these stories laid the groundwork for one of the most important themes of many SCP stories. So, stay tuned if you're interested. For such an amazing story that is intrinsically tied to so many horrifying concepts online, it is criminal just how unknown the BLIT series is. Today, I'm setting out to change that by reading it to you all. Naturally, if you prefer reading these stories yourself, I've linked the texts themselves, but I'm confident that this experience will be much better. I'll read out each story individually, sort of in the theme of those 4chan story YouTubers if you're familiar with those. The text will be on screen, and there will be some sound effects. After each story, I'll fill in some gaps, provide my thoughts, and at the very end of all 4, we'll talk about this grim world as a whole. So, dim the lights, pop in your favorite game, relax, and just listen. If you enjoy this experience, subscribe to my growing channel so that we can reach 100,000 subs as soon as possible. Consider joining the Discord as well, which is linked in the description, to be a part of our fun and help pick future video topics. Now, with all of the bases covered, I'm going to get started with our first story. It was like being caught halfway through a flashy film dissolve. The goggles broke up the dim street, split and reshuffled it along diagonal lines. A glowing kebab sign was transposed onto the typestyle they called shatter. Safest to keep the goggles on, Robo had decided. Even in the flickering electric half-light before dawn, you never knew what you might see. Just his luck if the stencil jumped from under his arm and unrolled itself before his eyes as he scrambled for it on the pavement. That would be a good place, behind the 34, a shattered 34, bus stop. This was their part of town. The women flocked there each morning, twittering in their saris like bright alien canaries. A good place, by a boarded-up shop window thick with fly-posted gig announcements. Robo scanned the street for movement, glanced at his own hand to be reassured by a blurred spaghetti of fingers. Guaranteed Army-issue goggles. The group had friends in funny places. But they say the eye eventually adjusts. One day, something clicks, and clear outlines jump at you. He flinched as the thick plastic unrolled. Then the nervy moment was past, his left hand pressing the stencil against a tattered poster, while in his right, the spray can hissed. The Swedish, heady smell of car touch-up paint made it all seem oddly distant from an act of terrorism. He found he'd been careless, easy in this false twilight and through these lenses. There were tacky patches on his fingers as he re-rolled the parrot. A few hours on, in thick morning light, The brown women would be playing the wink game. Jesus, how long since he'd been a kid and played that? Must be 5 years. The one who'd drawn the murder card caught your eye and winked. You had to die with lots of spasms and overreacting. To survive, you needed to spot the murderer first and get in with an accusation. Or at least, know where not to look. It was cold. Time to move on, to pick another place. Goggles or no shatter goggles, he didn't look back at the image of the parrot. It might wink.
So called because its outline, when processed for non-hazardous viewing, is generally considered to resemble that of the bird. A processed, anamorphically elongated, partial image being in Appendix 3 of this review, page A3II. The stated page must not be viewed through any form of cylindrical lens. Prolonged viewing is strongly disrecommended. Please read page A3I before proceeding. 2-6. This first example of the Berryman's logical image technique, hence the usual acronym BLIT, evolved from AI work at the Cambridge 4 supercomputer facility, now discontinued. V. Berryman and C. M. Turner hypothesized that pattern recognition programs of sufficient complexity might be vulnerable to Gouldian shock input in the form of data incompatible with internal representation. Berryman went further and suggested that the existence of such a potential input was a logical necessity. 2.18. Details of the Berryman-Turner BLIT construction algorithms are not available at this classification level. Details of the eventual security breach at Cambridge 4 are neither available nor fully known. Details of Cambridge 4 casualty figures are, for the time being, reserved. Sub Justice.
IRA got hold of it somehow, Mac had said. The Provos. We did some of our shopping in the same places. Jelly and like that. Slipped us a copy, they did. The cardboard tube in Robo's hand had suddenly felt 10 times as heavy. He'd expected a map, a group plan of action, maybe a blueprint of something nasty to plant in the Sikh temple up Victoria Street. You mean, it works? Fucking right. I tried it. Volunteer. He'd grinned. Just grinned and winked. Listen, this is poison stuff. Wear the goggles around it. If you fuck up and get a clear squint at even a bit of the parrot, this is what you do. They told me. Shut yourself up with a bottle of vodka and knock the whole thing back. Decontamination. Scrubs your short-term visual memory. Something like that. Jesus. What about the Provos? If this fairy story's got teeth, why haven't they... Robo had trailed off into a vague, waving gesture that failed to conjure up a paper neutron bomb. Mac's smile had widened into an assault course of brown, jagged teeth, as it did when he talked about a major group action. Maybe they don't fancy new ideas, but could be biding their time for a big one. Ever thought about hijacking a TV station? Just for an hour. Don't think things like that. It'll be bad for you. Dead TV screens watched from another cracked shop window, a dump that also rented Hindi videotapes. That settled it for them. Why couldn't the buggers learn English? The group would give them a hint. The parrot stencil was already in position, the can sliding out of his pocket, fastest draw in the West. At school, Robo had never won a fight. Had always been beaten down to cringing tears. He'd learned good, safe, satisfying ways of hitting back. AA group booby trap work was the best of all. A regular and addictive thrill. This had to be the last one, for now. Or last but one. 20 would be a good round number, but the sky seemed to be lightening behind its overlaid sodium light stain. If he went round Alma Street way, he could hit the Marquise of Granby, where everyone said the local gays hung out. Taking over a good old pub, bent as corkscrews and not even ashamed of it, give you AIDS as soon as they look at you, the bastards. Right in the middle of their glazed front door, glaring red and a foot high. The light hit him like a mailed fist. The goggles parsed it into bright, hurtful bars. Robo spun half around trying to shield his eyes with the heavy, flapping something in his left hand. The heavy something had a big irregular hole in it. Torchlight blared through, and moving quickly closer, there was a voice. Like to tell me what you're... As the beam dipped and the voice trailed off, he saw the shivered outline of a police helmet through that of the parrot. Behind jagged after images, a face came into view, an Asian face as he might have expected this end of town. The eyes stared blindly. The mouth worked. Robo had read old murder mysteries where the unmarked body wore an inexplicable expression of shock and dread. A warm corpse slumped into him, its momentum carrying them both through a window which dissolved in tinkling shards. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The bomb wasn't supposed to go off until you were 6 miles away. Somewhere, there was the broken outline of a second helmet.
Independently discovered by at least 2 late amateurs of computer graphics. The fractal star is generated by a relatively simple iterative procedure which determines whether any point in 2-dimensional space, the complex field, does or does not belong in its domain. This algorithm is now classified. 3-3. The fractal star does not exhibit BLIT properties in its macro structure. The overall appearance may be viewed. See Appendix 3, page A3II. This property allowed the star to be widely disseminated via a popular computer magazine, a version of the algorithm being printed under the heading Fun with Graphics. Unfortunately, the accompanying texts suggested that users rewrite the software to zoom in on aspects of the domain's visually appealing fractal microstructure in several zones of the complex field. This can produce BLIT effects when the resulting fine detail is displayed on a computer monitor of better than 600 by 300 pixel resolution. 3-4. Approximately 4% of the magazine's 115,000 readers discovered and displayed BLIT patterns latent within the fractal star. In most cases, other members of family units and/or emergency services inadvertently became viewers while investigating the casualty or casualties. Total figures are difficult to ascertain, but to the first order of approximation.
Tape the envelope all round. That's it. And write, danger, do not open, in ruddy big letters. Both sides, right? So you know all about it. There have been bulletins. The squatties picked up 50 in that Belfast raid. Leeds CID got another, some bastard just like this one. I tell you, this job's been a shambles for years, and now it's a fucking disaster. 3 constables and a sergeant gone, picking up a spotty little shit you could knock flying just by spitting at him. Robo hurt in a variety of places, but kept still and quiet, eyes shut, slumped on the hard bench where ungentle hands had dropped him. He'd told them every place he'd hit, but they'd kept on hurting him. It wasn't fair. He felt the draught of an opening door. Photo ID positive, sir. Robert Charles Bitton, 19, 2 previous for criminal damage, suspected link, Albion Action Group. Nothing much else on the printout. I suppose it makes sense. Vicious sods. Run into them yet, Jimmy? Nearest thing we've got here to the Ku Klux fucking Klan. This one will be out of circulation for a good long while. Jimmy, you haven't been keeping up to date with this Blitz stuff, have you? It's the same as that fucking nightmare with the kids and their home computers. God knows how much longer they can keep the lid on. It's gonna get us all sooner or later. Look, we're gonna have 4 PMs with cause of death unknown, immediate cause heart failure. Have I really gotta spell it out? Oh. The only evidence is in that sodding envelope. A real court cleaner, huh? I remember when they nicked those international phone fiddlers way back when, and all we could do them for was illegal use of electricity, to the value of 60p. They didn't have a phone hacker law those days. We haven't got a brain hacker law now. You mean we clean up after the little bastard, give him a nice room for what's left of the night, and that's it? Ah. The tone of the voice implied that something extra was going on. A gesture, a finger laid significantly alongside the nose, a wink. Car 3 cleans up, they've got the eye safety kit for what that's worth. We show young Master Urban Terrorism to his palatial quarters, taking the pretty way, of course. And then, Jimmy, when the new shift arrives, we hold a wake for our recently departed mates. No joking. It's in the last bulletin. You'll really appreciate hearing why. Robo braced himself as the hands got a fresh grip on him. The outlook sounded almost promising.
Informational analysis adopts a somewhat purist mathematical viewpoint, whereby BLITs are considered to encode Goldillian spoilers, implicit programs, which the human equipment cannot safely run. In his final paper, Berryman argued that although metallurgical safety devices permit the assimilation and safe recognition of self-referential loops, this sentence is false. The graphic analogies of subtler, vicious circles might evade protective verbal analysis by striking directly through the visual cortex. This may not be consistent with the observed effects of the reader BLIT discussed in Section 7. Unusual, not merely because its incapacitation of cortical activity is temporary, albeit with some observed permanent damage in Army volunteers, but also because its effects are specific to those literate in English and English-like alphabets. There may, in addition, be a logical inconsistency with the considerations developed in Section 12. 1018. Gott's post facto biochemical counterhypothesis was regarded as less drastic. This proposed that memotoxins might be formed in the brain by electrochemical activity associated with the storage of certain patterns of data. Although attractive, the hypothesis has yet to be 12.4. The present situation resembles that of the explosion in particle physics. Not merely new species of BLIT, but entire related families continue to emerge, as summarized in Appendix A2. One controversial interpretation invoked the Sheldrake theory of morphic resonance. It might be simpler to conclude that multiple simultaneous emergence of BLIT concept was inevitable at the stage of AI research which has been reached. The losses amongst leading theorists, in particular those with marked powers of mathematical visualization, constitute a major hindrance to further understanding.
The cell was white-tiled to shoulder height, glossily white-painted as it went up and up. Its reek of disinfectant felt like steel wool up the nose, down the throat. In a vague spirit of getting the most from the amenities, Robo patronized the white china toilet and scrubbed his hands futilely in the basin. Cold water couldn't shift out those red acrylic stains, before lying down to wait. They couldn't touch him, really. They might fine him on some silly vandalism charge, and he might accidentally fall down a few more flights of stairs before reaching the magistrate's court. Even now, the hard bunk caught him in all sorts of puffy, bruised places. But in the long run, he was okay. They knew that. But they hadn't seemed bothered, had they? He had a flash then of them smiling. "We aren't pressing charges, and this way, sir, and if you could just pick up your property." A door would open, and guess what would be waiting there for him to see? Silly. They wouldn't. But suppose. Time passed. The terminus was easy to imagine. He'd seen it so often through the shatter lenses, a long bird profile sliced at an angle and jaggedly resembled parrot salami. In outline against walls and windows and posters as a solid shape in glistening red that lost its color to orange sodium glare. In outline again as a dead man's broken eyes met his. It seemed to hover there, beneath his closed eyelids. He opened them and stared at the far-off ceiling, splattered with nameless blobs and blots by the efforts of past occupants. If you imagined joining the dots, images began to construct themselves, just as unconvincing as zodiac pictures. After a time, one image in particular threatened to achieve clear focus. He bit through his lip, took refuge in a brief whiteout of pain. It was in him. They knew. Even with protection, he'd looked for too long, from too many angles into the abyss. He was infected. Robo found himself batting at the heavy metal door, bloodying his hands. Useless. Because just as there was no clear crime he could have committed, there was no good medical reason why unfriendly police should offer him a massive, memory-clouding dose of alcohol. Flat on the bunk again, he ran for his life. The parrot stalked him through the gray hours of morning, smoothing its fractal feathers, shuffling itself slowly into clarity as though at the end of a flashy film dissolve, until at last his mind's eye had to acknowledge a shape. A wink. And that's the end of BLIT, the most well-known of these stories, which also kicked off the universe as a whole. I personally found it interesting and super unsettling, and was really perplexed by some of the thought-provoking questions brought up. The most notable part of this piece is obviously the introduction of BLIT images, which we'll learn later on stand for Berryman Logical Imaging Technique, though I'll just call them BLITs, which serve as the proverbial basilisks of this story. They're images that, through a biological process which we'll learn about a little bit later, shut down the human brain. This concept has since been replicated a bunch in science fiction, and has actually been coined the Langford hack, or the Langford visual hack, the concept that a mere image or piece of information could destroy your brain. Besides just the introduction of this revolutionary concept, we also get a gripping story that drip feeds us some exposition, like these paragraphs which seem to be from a lab report from the Cambridge 4 facility, where the BLIT was initially discovered. Fun fact, I'm going to drop some seed butter lore. I study at Cambridge, but sadly I'm not designing any lethal weapons. Anyway, our main character, Roko, is part of a terrorist organization called the Albion Action Group. We don't know much about this group besides the fact that they hate minorities and want to create a quote-unquote new Britain, which resembles that of the past, through violence and hate crimes. Somehow, the group gets its hand on two very important things: a design for the first BLIT called the Parrot due to its shape, and goggles which scramble your vision so that you can look at it safely for short periods of time. In the story, Roko takes a stencil that the group created to spray paint the parrot image onto walls in both a gay and Hindi district. Okay, so hang on. These characters get their hands on perhaps the greatest weapon ever known to man, and their first thought is, yeah, let's go commit some hate crimes. While Roko's plot is initially successful, he's apprehended and charged with vandalism, killing at least one police officer in the process. As he's held in jail, knowing he'll be able to escape because he hasn't technically done anything illegal, the police talk about his situation, revealing more interesting details. Finally, though, in a cruel twist for Roko, he starts to realize that, due to his prolonged exposure to the parrot, even though it was scrambled, the image is beginning to piece itself together in his brain. When this happens, the key remedy is of course getting hammered, but the police won't give him any alcohol, and eventually the image conjures itself in his mind, and he drops dead. This story isn't about the politics of Britain or anything like that. It raises much, much bigger questions. Questions I want to tackle at the end of this video and throughout when we look at everything. But here are some critical details that inform the rules of this universe. BLITs are extremely deadly. They don't have to be the static image. Anything that resembles the shape of the parrot, like the spray-painted copy made by Roko, can kill you. Simultaneously, even if you haven't seen the image, but you just conjure it up in your head, you will die, which opens up a gigantic can of worms about mysterious deaths from all of human history. I could talk about this story a lot longer, and at the beginning this video was just going to focus on BLIT. But I think our time is better spent reading the next story, titled What Happened at Cambridge 4, penned in 1990. To whom it may concern, there is death in this package. I send it to you because you're considered a dubious risk. Not by myself, I promise I have no notion of who you are or what you think. The address comes from a handy list compiled by our security office. A list, to put it bluntly, of potentially undesirable contacts in this part of the Thames Valley. If one of our staff were seen having a quiet drink with you, they would have been nudged. Of course, it's impossible to tell how reliably unreliable you are. When I look at list U and see people called Murphy and O'Shea, I can't help wondering whether any real probing was done, whether the computer just threw up its chips in horror at the name. Well, perhaps you're honestly outraged at the thought of being branded with a secret smear. I should tell the police if so. Obviously, you won't be the first. My advice in this case is not to open the sealed envelope that came with this. Don't open it yet, in any case. This is a serious warning. It's remotely possible that being an officious big mouth, of course a publicly spirited citizen, could ease your name into a computer file much less innocuous than any list at Cambridge 4. You could burn everything here, of course. But of course there'll be an investigation, and list U will be part of the information they work with. Alright, I hereby announce my intention of mailing this at random to only a certain number of the listed. Should you be the person I'm aiming for, hide this package and lie when they come to ask. You have an excellent chance of getting away with it. The innocent can leave us now. Still with me? Good. But be warned. People have already died for what you're holding. Before you think of opening the sealed envelope, you'll need some background. That isn't exactly true, but this is my last will and testament, and I make the rules. You won't be compromised. Yet. The background details are harmless. It's the big picture that kills. For all I know, you may be on list U simply for sharing a quirk with me. To begin, Cambridge 4 is much nearer to you than Cambridge, as you will have cleverly deduced from the postmark. This is governmental thinking. A discrete establishment with a focus on information technologies that have an oh-so-subtle computer evocative name. Somebody thought of Alan Turing, the theoretical pioneer. You may have heard of his famous thought experiments, the Turing machine, an abstract universal computer, and the Turing test. He was a fellow of King's at Cambridge, and that's all the connection there is. As for 1 to 3, they don't come into this. A discrete establishment is one your taxes pay for, which isn't surrounded by all the rigmarole or guard dogs, armed police, censor fences, and no photography. The only trace they leave, if big enough, is a blank white spot on ordnance survey maps. A good place to work if you like your privacy. Not so good when the funding begins to run out, since job security, unlike the other kind, is in short supply at a location that doesn't officially exist. So, I write from my green-walled office in a non-existent building. The only significant items are a graphics printout looking like a dark and hooked-beaked bird, a frozen bolt of lightning in perspex on my desk, and a bottle of whiskey whose level is sinking fast. Cambridge 4 funding has been steadily declining for 18 months. As deputy director, I have tried to keep it going, fought to keep Whitehall interested in what I told myself could be a vast new insight into minds, brains, and computers. Alternatively, the hydrogen bomb of psychological weapons. I snipped at the staffing table like a surgeon determined to prove that a human being can indeed live without limbs, a stomach, one lung, one kidney, half the liver, 2/3 of the brain. However, that dreary list goes on. I fought endless rearguard actions against the cuts, because I believed in... No. I can be honest here. In the beginning, I thought Cambridge 4 was the biggest damn tool idea since phlogiston. What I believed in was Vernon Berryman, the originator and research leader, and a man in the genius class of Turing himself. Poor Vernon. Alan Turing committed suicide, they say, in 1954. Do you know why? The climate is more liberal today, except in sensitive government establishments. If one were different, one could be blackmailed. What with? Well, one would lose one's sensitive job if it came out. Why should that be? Because we can't have people who could be blackmailed occupying sensitive government jobs. And so on. Forever. Dr. Vernon Berryman did not commit suicide. He had a regrettable accident. He had a triumphant accident. A crabbed accountant in Whitehall killed him. I killed him. Each man kills the things he loves. Let me tell you about the project work now. Siri Turner was supposed to be the physiological/neurological expert, digging out data about the brain's wiring for Berryman and his mathematical models. Smooth, blonde, heavily perfumed, the sort of overstuffed young woman who gives wet dreams to teenagers. Her legs were quite nice, if you liked the type. I was unconvinced about her on the intellectual side. She came from America, where they'll hand a PhD to anything that can read, write, and sit on its bottom for long enough. Berryman was absurdly courteous, giving her joint credit for papers which were 95% his. If his name had been Werryman, I swear he'd have even put hers first. She provided the input, and Berryman worked miracles. I should copy some bits out of their major paper here. You won't find it in Nature or New Scientist. The classification is secret * basilisk, named distribution only. It's sort of a small honor for an establishment as tiny as Cambridge 4 to have its own identifying marking. Basilisk is very much nearer the bone than the Cambridge illusion, as you'll see. An indication, perhaps, that those who hand out such labels didn't really take us seriously. As I said, I could reprint parts of On Thinkable Forms with notes towards a logical imaging technique here. But if I know you, as naturally I don't, you're a practical person. You have no interest in sitting through 20 pages on the Entscheidungsproblem, Gödel's theorem, and Berryman's own unnerving theoretical extensions. Instead, there's a little indoctrination chat I know by heart and trot out for visiting dignitaries and purse string holders. It's as practical as an Armalite rifle. It goes like this. Kurt Gödel showed that all formal logical systems have flaws, true theorems that can't be proved, shattering paradoxes that won't go away. Alan Turing translated this into practical terms with his proof that some problems aren't computable. An ideal computer set to solve them would grind on forever. Vernon Berryman noted that the human mind can be thought of as a computer, assumed that Turing's computability has a parallel in human thinkability, and set out to find the logical input which clouds the minds of men. His new insight? While the mind can always refuse to accept a problem, the pattern handling systems of the visual cortex can instantly and willy-nilly accept huge blocks of data from the eye. In other words, I'd say at this point, as I poured out the restorative dose of single malt, Dr. Berryman thinks that with a neural computer system the size of the Supernode Plus in our basement, plus present-day knowledge of how the brain works, we have the key to uncomputable problems that take advantage of the flaws which mathematics says the mind must have. A pattern which compels attention, perhaps. A pattern from which you couldn't easily look away. And depending on rather careful judgment of my audience, male, reasonably bright, sense of humor, like me or not, I'd then produce a big card-mounted penthouse nude and watch the sequence. Attention momentarily caught in quick lime, an artificial blink, a studied glance away, with excessive unconcern. We're all so predictable. If I was lucky, they'd finish the sequence with a smile. There, I'm not as old and stuffy as you'd expect of a deputy director. I feel I do need to wear a dark suit and waistcoat, but I draw the line at Whitehall's pinstripes. If I hadn't decided otherwise, there'd be years to go before retirement, or even the Big Six. Not past it at all. Berryman was 34. They say mathematicians do their best work relatively young. Turing cracked the Einstein's problem in his 20s. I would never have made a fool of myself over Berryman, but I did, though. I made an infernal machine. The latest round of government cuts was threatening the Supernode Plus itself. If we fired 2 more operators, the shift system would break down and the wretched machine wouldn't be able to handle Berryman's all-night runs. That was the week after I knew what was wrong with me. Wrong or gloriously right. Absurd to tell of it. I passed Berryman in the corridor as he padded off to the toilet in his shirt sleeves, and something turned over inside of me. Narrow-faced and intense, very white skin and very black hair, and the dark shadow of his nipples through the thin shirt. I was married for 8 tolerably pleasant years until May went down with cancer. Nothing in those years ever hit with a lightning flash like that. One picks at these details, the turn of a head, the curl of a thin finger, and tries to pin down blame. The details explain nothing. It's the sum of the total that kills. If Cambridge 4 had to shut down, its director would be retired or just possibly transferred, while its mathematical genius carried its hat around half a dozen universities that would love to have him if only they could justify the project grants. Perhaps the Turner woman would follow him too. I felt sure she was making eyes at him. Never to pass in a corridor again. I was very circumspect, very discreet. But I built an infernal machine. Did a little shock of interest go through you then? Perhaps you're my man. Nothing intricate or mechanical. I have the remnants of a science degree, but my fingers are too sausage clumsy for work like that. No, I traveled first class into the vast anonymity of London and bought 2 gadgets from a photographic outfit in the Tottenham Court Road. A cosmopolitan little shop in Soho supplied the newspaper, and I spent £5 more on a cheap piece of plastic trash from an open suitcase on the pavement. I was insane, of course. You might as well know the details. The sonic shutter is supposed to be for self and group portraits. Whistle or snap your fingers, and the shutter clicks, the flash gun fires. It had stuck in my mind for its sheer stupidity. Who wants to be photographed for posterity with pursed lips or cocked fingers? The electronic flash gun was the cheapest available, and the point about the trashy digital watch was its alarm. Wearing lab gloves, I taped and wired them all together to give me a timed flash. But first I took pliers and wrenched off the flash gun's battery compartment cover. Now, as anyone could see, the battery would stay put only if wedged. A wad of paper did the trick nicely, folded from the imported Russian language edition of Pravda. There's no great level of internal security. Cambridge 4 doesn't exist, so prowlers are not expected. Often you can pace alone through the dead light and air, listening to that feeble roar of ventilation which always makes me think corridors of power. I paid one of my occasional visits to the computer hall, where an unreal universe of silicon and optoelectronics, a ghostly simulation of the human brain, was under attack, assaulted by Berryman's image programs, and so far, resisting every one. The brain's electrochemical immune system had fended off most of the things that conceptual virus evolution can throw at it. Though intangible things can go wrong, can't they? And do. As always, activity stopped while I looked officiously around. Siri Turner lay with eyes closed on the interface couch, meditating or some such nonsense, while the EEG fed the simulation with her brain rhythms. Her red-stocked legs were stretched out vulgarly, the idea of her as a standard Brave Wave reference. The operators stared in resentment at their keyboards, unwilling to catch my eye in case I commented on paperbacks and playing cards. My package of junk went onto a high, blue bank of power conditioners. I blew my nose loudly into the handkerchief I'd wrapped around my fingers. That was all. The cleaners would be suspected, but you can't make an omelet, etc. I was insane, of course. The misery forces of Whitehall had made me insane. I wanted to turn on their own murderous paranoid logic against them, to jolt them into the notion that an establishment worth sabotaging must be an establishment worth preserving. But perhaps I'm being too clever for you. My infernal machine doesn't sound very deadly? Trust me, it was far deadlier than I thought. In the vague spirit of self-improvement, I always used to skim the computer newspapers sent free throughout the trade. Officially, we are Amber Data Systems, to account for our purchasing pattern. One can pick up some interesting information. Specifically, the reason why flash photography tends to be forbidden in major computer installations. Next morning, floppy-jowled Simmond, our security chief, explained it all to me pompously, with vast technical detail about the intricate electronics that had been used. He had become important for a day, and was savoring it ad nauseum. The misguided saboteur, he said, must have assumed the computer had an old-fashioned fire protection system. Electrical fires often start with a brilliant flash. I nodded my wise head of total incomprehension. Had the sensors been connected to an old-style array of sprinklers, the entire computer system could have been soaked and ruined. Luckily, the saboteur didn't know one important fact. I managed another blank nod. Modern defenses like ours stop fires in their tracks by sealing all doors and driving out every trace of oxygen with a flood of fire-retardant gas. So no damage was done, I said. The operators, of course, are trained to run like hell when the siren sounds. There'll be a manslaughter charge when we catch the bastard. For too long, I stared blankly at the fossil lightning on my desk. Afterwards, I worked out there was no trap. Simon failed to eye me critically while tossing his thunderbolt, failed to note the whirliness and shock that drove the sense from me in a flood of inert horror. Through the churning, I dimly caught the word doctor. Simon bored remorselessly on about the unauthorized late-night sessions. Berryman had been driving himself hard, and the picture filled itself in automatically. A visit to collect printout or whatever. Sirens, panic, a slip and fall in belated haste, a moment's dizzy confusion, and the doors are sealed. Then, Simon dropped a new word into my numbness, and curdled it into something else. The word was she. A doctor can be a PhD as well as a DPhil. Siri Turner had been running late that night, on into the night with one of Berryman's runs, and the idiot woman had tested a private theory I couldn't have predicted. She died through her own fecklessness. I refused to accept any blame. I had nothing against her, nothing serious. I hoped she and Berryman hadn't anything between them, because if so, I wouldn't be able to be sorry. Simon departed with hints that there would be international ramifications, and that he had a clue. It would have been a terrible thing, on that morning, to laugh. What an idea, though! More sympathetic magic than science. It was in her notebook. I have it here now. A pastel thing with flowers on its cover and austerely scientific heading, Thinks, number 136. Input reference level brainwave patterns association with forced loss of consciousness. Quaaludes? And with the crazed open-mindedness of Darwin experimentally playing the trombone to his tulips, she'd fed herself a safe dose of barbiturates on the couch, only that night, nothing that blocked out sirens was safe. They found her convulsed and ugly, still linked to the systems. I cannot accept enough. So I'd bought us time by the logic of Whitehall, at the cost of a sacrifice. The investigation pottered on for a while, the only result being a revised and slightly shorter List U. They might have found and deported some suspicious immigrants, or cleared others from all shadow of a doubt, who knows. Funding was discreetly increased. What I'd done didn't deserve to work, but it had. Berryman worked on furiously. He said he was sniffing on the track of something new. Rich, uncharted seas, he said. Siri, I'm sorry. I need time. There was a trace of guilt when he mentioned her name, as though he and I were accomplices. I didn't understand that until later. I had to ration my contacts with Berryman for fear of being caught staring at the fine, silky hairs on the backs of his hands. Nor could I avoid him. This was no time to distort the pattern of our days at Cambridge 4, and perhaps attract attention. For almost the first time in my life, I regretted my middle-class education. At a public school, I'd gathered certain overtures are learned. Could I have picked up a body language familiar to Dr. Vernon Berryman of Winchester and, like Turing himself, King's? Time passed. The project reports grew ever more optimistic. The mathematical brain model took some hard knocks, but in spite of Berryman's frantic, doomed intensity, we seemed no nearer to a real-world version of the simulated success. One of the failed images is still pinned to my dingy office wall. A horrid black thing, like half a Rorschach's blot, a fractal shape whose outline vaguely suggested a bird. I remember the weekly project working party meeting at which we solemnly discussed what safeguard should be taken against an active image, one that really did stab into the visual cortex with stunning or paralyzing force. The psychiatric liaison woman suggested the scrambler glasses used in some perception test. The things were made specially at a frightful price, and we couldn't justify the purchase at that time. In the early days of the Manhattan Project, did they ponder on better bulletproof vests and stouter plate glass to withstand the new weapon? I wonder. Gradually, the money supply began to fall off again, not overtly cut, but gently eroded by inflation. 3 times a day I sighted Berryman and felt the impossible gulf widen between us. Other times I sat at the wide mahogany desk appropriate to my rank and made wild plans. I would put forward the theory of a broad spectrum of response to the image technique. Volunteers would be called for. I would steal equipment from the optics lab that we never used. Trial viewings of test images would take place under laboratory conditions. Somehow I'd manipulate the volunteer selection process. My weak-eyed epileptic subject would come in for a test on a sunny day wearing Polaroid glasses. Unknown to anyone else, the window opening on the harmless image would conceal a Polaroid sheet, which a hidden motor could rotate. Gazing through glasses and window on Berryman's latest effort, my victim's field of vision would flicker on and off as the planes of polarization crossed and recrossed. The blink rate would be 5 times a second. Petit mal. Berryman vindicated. Roars of applause. That was one of my more sensible schemes. I had gone so far as to check that the optics lab had stocks of Polaroid plastic. It was, of course, a mere fantasy. The real end of Cambridge 4 has outdone any of my fantasies. Each man kills. It happened between 3 and 4 hours ago. I can only write the postscript and obituary. Why did we think that when the human computer tried to tackle a visual program it could not run, the only result would be disorientation? The nastiest of the ironies is that I, put out to grass as a mere administrator, laid the fuses of catastrophic success all by myself. Siri Turner had a wild theory that brainwave feedback from drugged sleep would lower the supernode's simulation defenses. Later, when Berryman analyzed the session records, he found something better than a digitized pattern of sleep. It could be the making of his career at her expense. And did he love the woman? Did he? The electromagnetic signature of death. The frozen lightning bolt sits at my desk, a souvenir from the gigavolt facility at... well, never mind. Most people think it's sort of a feathery white seaweed or curl preserved in perspex. Plastic is charged to a whopping voltage throughout, and an earth spike driven through the base. When the smoke clears, the forking fractal paths of the discharge are captured forever. The final lightning stroke in Turner's mind was caught like that, in silicon and optoelectronics, for Berryman to discover. Show a scientist a pattern, and he can usually figure out how to reproduce it. Oh God. There's a grim scene I remember from Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, where knight after armored knight is felled by an electric fence. A growing heap of death as each hapless knight touches the conductive armor of the last. This, brought up to date, is the picture I saw in Vernon Berryman's workroom. The first fruit of our collaboration. His work is a brilliant success. The desk faces his door. The graphics display is thus not visible until, one by one, the passing project technicians go to find why Berryman is slumped in his chair and look over his shoulder into the terminal. Only I, on my regular tormented visit, had the faith to believe in his triumph. Instead of peeping at once, I went away and thought. It was with closed eyes that I snapped my way through roll after roll of the Polaroid, capital P this time, film they used to record EEG displays. This is the other reason why you should not have opened the sealed envelope. It also contains the standard format computer diskette holding the last few notes and programs, downloaded from a dead man's terminal. You must know a bright computer enthusiast with your own political leanings, one who can make use of Berryman's graphics algorithms. Tell him to be very careful. Why? Why all this? Indirectly, I killed Berryman myself. Whitehall killed him too, both through miserable funding. He might have viewed his latest ungrateful pet through the scrambler optics we couldn't afford, and by starting a project which one might say was morally appalling. Before you sneer, these are all quibbles. I don't care about people anymore. When I began to care especially for you-know-who, the relationship was killed by intolerant, paranoid policies before it ever could be born. You are my revenge. Afraid of AIDS, are they? Now there's a psychic AIDS that's no respecter of rubbery protectives. Open the envelope with great caution. Remember, politicians don't like to fiddle around with details. They want an overview of the big picture. Send a letter to your MP for me. Myself? A last glass of the pale Glenlivet, for VIP visitors only. A last walk outside Cambridge 4, before bulging with Her Majesty's prepaid envelopes to the nearest pillar box in a crowded, sunlit high street. And finally, I'll join the sacrificial victims, heaped behind my love like Egyptian servants in a noble's tomb. And before I look into the screen and over the edge, I'll touch his hand at last. And with that, we've finished one of the longer pieces of this Basilisk saga. And regardless of how you feel about the actual story and how it was written, the amount of exposition laid out is insane. What happened at Cambridge 4 turned BLIT from just a thought experiment showed off in a short story to an actual universe with lore, much more of which we'll see soon. The story was really long and wasn't entirely clear at times, in my opinion. It's also full of a lot of academic jargon or other themes that I personally didn't get on the first read, so I'll go over a lot of what happened. The story itself is a letter sent by a mathematician at the secret Cambridge 4 facility to an unnamed contact who, by the mathematician's own confession, was found on a list of employees considered to be security risks. I don't actually get if this is supposed to be ex-employees or just like a general government watch list, because it doesn't really make sense why the laboratory would just have a list of random individuals who couldn't be trusted, but it doesn't really matter. It's really just an excuse to frame the story as a narrator writing down his last testament to an unnamed recipient. A recipient who would absolutely leak this information to the press, which is how the story kicks off in the first place. Who knows, maybe this unsavory person was part of the Albion Action Group or IRA, which would actually feed directly into the first story. One way or another, the mathematician does this on purpose, because he's looking to confess his account to someone who is willing and able to leak this information to the press. His package contains his letter and a copy of the killer photo itself. Let's talk more about that. We learned that the narrator was in love with Dr. Berryman, and actually worked behind the scenes to get more funding for Cambridge 4 so that he could watch Berryman succeed. He does this by sabotaging the facility's supercomputer in an attempt to present Cambridge 4 as a target. By making it look like someone would want to take it out, the research looks more significant. Doing this, however, actually kills Dr. Turner, a woman working under Berryman to make a computer model of the human brain to test BLIT images on. She wanted to see what would happen if the machine scanned her brain waves while she was sleeping. So, when oxygen was driven out of the room during the sabotage attempt, she died because she was under the influence of drugs to keep her sleeping. In part because of her death, but also the new funding, Berryman is pushed and pushed to accomplish the feat of creating a BLIT image, assuming, along with the rest of the lab, that the image would only cause dizzying or nauseating effects. While this is going on, our narrator continues manipulating the tests, picking compromised volunteers with epilepsy, for example, to feign progress. Though a lot of this is sci-fi mumbo-jumbo that can't actually be deciphered, we begin to understand what creates these basilisks. To first understand that, let me talk a little bit about Kurt Gödel. Now, I'm not a logistician or a math guy in any capacity, but in those fields, Gödel is one of the most important figures of recent history. Highlighted in this story is one specific contribution from him: the idea that math and the universe is full of things that are true but cannot be proven. Paradoxes. Now, Berryman, one of the parents of BLIT imaging, built off that Gödelian thinking by first imagining the human mind as a computer. He envisioned that certain images, which were basically fractals, could embody these paradoxes. And the visual cortex, confused by the seemingly infinite patterns in the fractals, would try and run one of these unsolvable programs. This, in what can be called a Gödelian spoiler, causes the human brain to crash, like a computer, leading to an instant death. Now, I've highlighted SCPs a few times, but just to double down on this, one thing about SCPs, and also a lot of other stories on the internet, is the use of Gödel's name. Gödelian this, Gödelian that, Gödelian shock input, and for me personally, I never fully understood what that meant. I just thought math, or edgy math. This story right here is where the idea of Gödelian shock input comes from. And thus, many aspects of Cognitohazards or theoretical basilisks are inspired by this short story. In fact, in one SCP-001 proposal and in some SCP stories here and there, the Memetic kill agent so frequently mentioned in that universe is referred to as the Berryman-Langford Memetic kill agent, named of course off of the character and the real-life author. There are actually a ton of Langford and Berryman characters written into the SCP universe as well, which I think is kind of interesting. So yeah, it's just a really cool point I sought out to address in this video. This short story, and specifically the slightly less popular sequel, created the idea of these memetic kill agents in the SCP universe, and whenever you read or hear an SCP story that references this, you'll better understand what the kill agent actually is. Again, for as much as these characters are interwoven into online discourse and sci-fi topics, I'm surprised that this story isn't cited as inspiration that much. Okay, done with SCPs for now, I'm gonna move on. So yeah, basically this story paved the way for world building in this universe. Now, the third and shortest story, which is actually my personal favorite in the series, goes even further. Let's go ahead and check this one out. One, what is the purpose of this news group? To provide a forum for discussion of basilisk, BLIT images. Newsnet readers who prefer low traffic should read comp.basilisk.moderated, which carries only high priority warnings and identifications of new forms. 2. Can I post binary files here? If you are capable of asking this question, you must immediately read news.announce.new users, where regular postings warn that binary, and especially image files, may emphatically not be posted to any newsgroup. Many countries impose a mandatory death penalty for such action. 3. Where does the acronym BLIT come from? The late unlamented Dr. Veroni Berryman's system of maths to visual algorithms is known as the Berryman Logical Imaging Technique. This reflected the original paper's title, On Thinkable Forms with Notes Towards a Logical Imaging Technique. Inevitably, the paper has since been suppressed and classified to a high level. 4. Is it true that science fiction authors predicted basilisks? Yes and no. The idea of unthinkable information that cracks the mind has a long sci fi pedigree, but no one got it quite right. William Gibson's Neuromancer, 1984, the novel that popularized cyberspace, is often cited for its concept of black ice software, which strikes back at the minds of hackers. But this assumes direct neural connection to the net. Basilisks are far more deadly because they require no physical contact. Much earlier, Fred Hoyle's The Black Cloud, 1957, suggested that a download of knowledge provided by a would-be helpful alien who has superhuman mental capacity could overload them and burn out human minds. A remarkable near miss features in The Shapes of Sleep, 1962, by J.B. Priestley, which imagined archetypal shapes that compulsively evoke particular emotions, intended for use in advertising. Piers Anthony's Macroscope, 1969, described the Destroyer sequence, a purposeful sequence of images used to safeguard the privacy of galactic communications by erasing the minds of eavesdroppers. The comp.basilisk community does not want ever again to see another posting about the hoary coincidence that Macroscope appeared in the same year and month as the first episode of the British TV program Monty Python's Flying Circus, with its famous sketch about the world's funniest joke that causes all hearers to laugh themselves to death. 5. How does a basilisk operate? The short answer is, we mustn't say. Detailed information is classified beyond top secret. The longer answer is based on a popular science article by Berryman, New Scientist 2001, which outlines his thinking. He imagined the human mind as a formal, deterministic computational system, a system that, as predicted by a variant of Gödel's theorem in mathematics, can be crashed by thoughts that the mind is physically or logically incapable of thinking. The logical imaging technique presents such a thought in purely visual form as a basilisk image, which our optic nerves can't help but accept. The result is disastrous, like a software stealth virus smuggled into the brain. 6. Why basilisk? It's the name of a mythical creature, a reptile whose mere gaze can turn people into stone. According to ancient myth, a basilisk can only be safely viewed in a mirror. This is not generally true of the modern version, although some highly asymmetric basilisks like B-756 are lethal only in unreflected or reflected form, depending on the dominant hemisphere of the victim's brain. 7. Is it just an urban legend that the first basilisk destroyed its creator? Almost everything about the incident at the Cambridge 4 supercomputer facility where Berryman conducted his last experiments has been suppressed and classified as highly undesirable knowledge. It's generally believed that Berryman and most of the facility staff died. Subsequently, copies of Basilisk B1 leaked out. This image is famously known as the parrot for its shape when blurred enough to allow safe viewing. B1 remains the favorite choice of urban terrorists who use aerosols and stencils to spray basilisk images on walls by night. But others were at work on Berryman's speculations. B2 was soon generated at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory and, disastrously, B3 at MIT. 8. Are there basilisks in the Mandelbrot set fractal? Yes. There are two known families at symmetrical positions visible under extreme magnification. No, we are not telling you where. 9. How can I get permission to display images on my website? This is a news.announce.new users question, but keeps cropping up here. In brief, you can't without a rarely granted government license. Using anything other than plain ASCII text on websites or an email is a guaranteed way of terminating your net account. We're all nostalgic about the old, colorful web and about television, but today's risks are simply too great. 10. Is it true that Microsoft uses basilisk booby traps to protect Windows 2005 from disassembly and pirating? We could not possibly comment. This story is beyond creative, and the framing is super ahead of its time. Stepping away from the first-person storytelling format, we actually get a glimpse into an FAQ board from this universe, years and years after the events at Cambridge 4. Specifically, we learn a little bit about what life looks like in a world where pictures can kill you instantly, and how humanity had to adapt to those consequences. We learn the answers to 10 questions, all of which have terrifying implications. Let's go over them quickly. Question 1 simply introduces us to the group. Question 2 answers if one can post binary files, to which the answer is a resounding no, suggesting that if you even understand the implications of that question, you're up to no good, because you're spreading BLIT images. Below this, though, the answer reads that disseminating these files, especially image types, results in a death penalty almost anywhere. So right off the bat, we could see global implications resulting from BLIT images becoming widespread, and glimpse at just how much the world has changed. Question 3 examines the acronym BLIT, referencing the journal article published from the second story. Question 4 asks if sci-fi authors predicted the existence of BLITs, which is kind of funny. It reads as like Langford patting himself on the back, and more importantly, showing off some stories that, to me, indicate that Langford himself took some inspiration from them when creating his own universe. It's almost like Langford's writing a love letter to science fiction here, specifically that which inspired his story. Question 5 adds on to the previously discussed information from the last story, basically explaining how the BLIT images smuggle a virus into the human brain. Question 6 is pretty fun, and explains why Langford uses the term basilisk to describe these images, referencing the mythical creature. This nomenclature stuck, as other thought experiments like Roko's basilisk have kept the same name. Question 7 details more history of the world, adding on that the parrot is referenced to as B1, and that B2 and B3 came soon after. Though there are a ton of basilisks now, B1 is still a favorite amongst terrorists. Question 8 is super cool. It references the Mandelbrot fractal, which is a famous fractal you've probably seen simulated before. It states that under extreme magnification, there are actually at least 2 known basilisks lurking in it, and naturally, the author says that he won't tell you where. For those of you who don't know, you can examine and identify your position in the Mandelbrot set fractal based on coordinates and the degree of your zoom, which is obviously how you would locate the BLIT images. Question 9 gives us perhaps the biggest look into Langford's apocalyptic world. No one, except the government or those who rarely get licenses, can upload images online anymore. That's right, with very limited exceptions, there is no more visual media, not even TV, because there's such a risk of someone hiding a basilisk in it. Question 10 wraps up the story with a fascinating comment, with the user asking if Microsoft is using basilisks as anti-piracy measures, to which the author does not provide an answer. It's funny to talk about, especially after that recent trend of anti-piracy screens from a few years ago, if you remember back to that. I love laughing at some of those cheesy ones people came up with, where it's just like a video game character saying you're gonna die for pirating a game or something like that. But in this case, you literally would. And it's hilarious too, because corporations would probably take advantage of this. The use of a BLIT image comes with so much plausible deniability that kind of a no-brainer. The implications of this forum are clear, in that this is not a world I would want to live in. I do want to end this video with a more hopeful note, which we'll actually do with this final story, titled Different Kinds of Darkness. It was always dark outside the windows. Parents and teachers sometimes said vaguely that this was all because of some deep green terrorists, but Jonathan thought there was more to the story. The other members of the Shutter Club agreed. The dark beyond the window glass at home, at school, and on the school bus was the second kind of darkness. You could often see a little bit in the first kind, the ordinary kind, and of course you could slice through it with a torch. The second kind of darkness was utter black, and not even the brightest electric torch showed a visible beam or lit anything up. Whenever John watched his friends walk out through the school door ahead of him, it was as though they stepped into a solid brick wall. But when he followed them and felt blindly along the handrail to where the homeward bus would be waiting, there was nothing around him but empty air. Black air. Sometimes you found those super dark places indoors. Right now, Jonathan was edging his way to a black corridor, one of the school's no-go areas. Officially, he was supposed to be outside, mucking around for a break period in the high-walled playground where, oddly enough, it wasn't dark at all and you could see the sky overhead. Of course, outdoors was no place for the dread secret initiations of the Shutter Club. Jonathan stepped out to the far side of the corridor's inky dark section and quietly opened the door of the little storeroom they'd found 2 terms ago. Inside, the air was warm, dusty, and stale. A bare light bulb hung from the ceiling. The others were already there, sitting on boxes of paper and stacks of battered textbooks. "You're late," chorused Gary, Julie, and Khalid. The new candidate, Heather, just pushed back long blonde hair and smiled a slightly strained smile. "Someone has to be last," said Jonathan. The words had become part of the ritual, like a secret password that proved that the last one to arrive wasn't an outsider or a spy. Of course, they all knew each other, but imagine a spy who was a master of disguise. Khalid solemnly held up an innocent-looking ring binder. That was his privilege. The club had been his idea after he'd found the boogie picture that someone had left behind in the school photocopier. Maybe he'd read too many stories about ordeals and secret initiations. When you'd stumbled on such a splendid ordeal, you simply had to invent a secret society to use it. "We are the Shutter Club," Khalid intoned. "We are the ones who can take it. 20 seconds. Jonathan's eyebrows went up. 20 seconds was serious. Gary, the fat boy of the gang, just nodded and concentrated on his watch. Khalid opened the binder and stared at the thing inside. 1, 2, 3. He almost made it. It was past the 17-second mark when Khalid's hands started to twitch and shudder, and then his arms. He dropped the book, and Gary gave him a final count of 18. There was a pause while Khalid overcame the shakes and pulled himself together, and then they congratulated him on a new record. Julie and Gary weren't feeling so ambitious and opted for 10-second ordeals. They both got through, though by the count of 10 she was terribly white in the face and he was sweating great drops. So Jonathan felt he had to say 10 as well. "You sure, John?" said Gary. "Last time you were on 8. No need to push it today." Jonathan quoted the ritual words. "We are the ones who can take it," and took the ring binder from Gary. 10. In between times, you almost forgot exactly what the boogie picture looked like. It always seemed new. It was an abstract black and white pattern, swirly and flickery like one of those op art designs. The shape was almost pretty until the whole thing got in your head with a shock of connection like touching a high-voltage wire. It messed with your eyesight. It messed with your brain. Jonathan felt violent static behind his eyes, an electrical storm raging somewhere in there, instant fever singing through the blood, muscles locking and unlocking, and oh dear God, had Gary only counted 4? He held on somehow, forcing himself to keep still when every part of him wanted to twitch in different directions. The dazzle of the boogie picture was fading behind a new kind of darkness, a shadow inside his eyes, and he knew with dreadful certainty that he was going to faint or be sick or both. He gave in and shut his eyes just as, unbelievably, and after what had seemed like years, the count reached 10. Jonathan felt too limp and drained to pay attention as Heather came close, but not close enough to the 5 seconds you needed to be a full member of the club. She blotted her eyes with a violently trembling hand. She was sure she'd make it next time. And Khalid closed the meeting with the quotation that he'd found somewhere. "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." School was a place where, mostly, they taught you about stuff that had nothing to do with the real world. Jonathan secretly reckoned that quadratic equations just didn't ever happen outside the classroom. So it came as a surprise to the club when things started getting interesting in, of all places, a maths class. Mr. Whitcutt was quite old, somewhere between grandfather and retirement age, and didn't mind straying away from the official maths course once in a while. You had to lure him with the right kind of question. Little Harry Steen, the chess and war games fanatic of the class, and under consideration for the club, scored a brilliant success by asking about a news item he'd heard at home. It was something to do with math war, and terrorists using things called blitz. "I actually knew Vernon Berryman slightly," said Mr. Whitcutt, which didn't seem at all promising. But it got better. He's the B in BLIT, you know. BLIT, the Berryman Logical Imaging Technique, as he called it. Very advanced mathematics. Over your heads, probably. Back in the first half of the 20th century, two great mathematicians called Gödel and Turing proved theorems which, well, one way of looking at it is that mathematics is booby-trapped. For any computer at all, there are certain problems that will crash it and stop it dead. Half the class nodded knowingly. Their homemade computer programs so often did exactly that. Berryman was another brilliant man and an incredible idiot. Right at the end of the 20th century, he said to himself, what if there are problems that crash the human brain? And he went out and found one, and came up with his wretched imaging technique that makes a problem you can't ignore. Just looking at a BLIT pattern, letting it in through your optic nerves, can stop your brain. A click of old naughty fingers. Like that. Jonathan and the club looked sidelong at each other. They knew something about staring at strange images. It was Harry, delighted to have stolen all this time from boring old Trigg, who stuck up his hand first. Did this Berryman look at his own pattern, then? Mr. Whitcutt gave a gloomy nod. The story is that he did. By accident, and it killed him stone dead. It's ironic. For centuries, people had been writing ghost stories about things so awful that just looking at them makes you die of fright. And then a mathematician, working in the purest and most abstract of all the sciences, goes and brings the stories to life. He grumbled on about BLIT terrorists like the Deep Greens who didn't need guns and explosives, just a photocopier or a stencil that let them spray deadly graffiti on walls. According to Whitcutt, TV broadcasts used to go out live, not taped, until the notorious activist T0 broke into a BBC studio and showed the cameras a BLIT known as the Parrot. Millions had died. It wasn't safe to look at anything these days. Jonathan had to ask. So, the special kind of dark outdoors is to stop people seeing stuff like that? Well, yes, in effect that's quite right. The old teacher rubbed his chin for a moment. They brief you about all that when you're a little older. It's a bit of a complicated issue. Another question? It was Khalid who had his hand up. With an elaborate lack of interest that struck Jonathan as desperately unconvincing, he said, are all these BLIT things really dangerous, or are there ones that just jolt you a bit? Mr. Whitcutt looked at him for nearly the length of a beginner's ordeal. Then he turned to the whiteboard with its scrawled triangles. Quite. As I was saying, the cosine of an angle is defined, blah blah blah. The four members of the inner circle had drifted casually together in their special corner of the outdoor play area, by the dirty climbing frame that no one ever used. So we're terrorists, said Julie cheerfully. We should give ourselves up to the police. No, our picture's different, Gary said. It doesn't kill people, it, a chorus of four voices, makes us stronger. Jonathan said, what do Deep Greens terrorize about? I mean, what don't they like? I think it's biochips, Khalid said uncertainly. Tiny computers for building into people's heads. They say it's unnatural or something. There was a bit about it in one of those old issues of New Scientist in the lab. Be good for exams, Jonathan suggested, but you can't take calculators into the exam room. Everyone with a biochip, please leave your head at the door. They all laughed, but Jonathan felt a tiny shiver of uncertainty, as though he'd stepped on a stair that wasn't there. Biochip sounded very like something he'd overheard in one of his parents' rare shouting matches. And he was pretty sure he'd heard unnatural too. Please don't let Mom and Dad be tangled up with terrorists, he thought suddenly. But it was too silly. They weren't like that. There was something about control systems too, said Khalid. You wouldn't want to be controlled now. As usual, the chatter soon went off in a new direction, or rather, an old one. The walls of Type 2 darkness that the school used to mark off-limits areas like the corridor leading to the old storeroom. The club were curious about how it worked and had done some experiments. Some of the things they knew about the dark and had written down were Khalid's visibility theory, which had been proven by painful experiment. Dark zones were brilliant hiding places when it came to hiding from other kids, but teachers could spot you even through the blackness and tick you off something rotten for being where you shouldn't be. Probably they had some kind of special detector, but no one had ever seen one. Jonathan's bus footnote to Khalid's discovery was simply that the driver of the school bus certainly looked as if he was seeing something through the black windscreen. Of course, this was Gary's idea. The bus might be computer-guided, with the steering wheel turning all by itself and the driver just pretending, but why should he bother? Julie's mirror was the weirdest thing of all. Even Julie hadn't believed it could work, but if you stood outside a Type 2 dark place and held a mirror just inside so it looked as though your arm was cut off by the black wall, you could shine a torch at the place where you couldn't see the mirror, and the beam would come bouncing back out of the blackness to make a bright spot on your clothes or the wall. As Jonathan pointed out, this was how you could have bright patches of sunlight on the floor of the classroom whose windows all looked into protecting darkness. It was a kind of dark that light could travel through, but eyesight couldn't. None of the optics textbooks said a word about it. By now, Harry had his club invitation and was counting the minutes to his first meeting on Tuesday, 2 days away. Perhaps he would have some ideas for some new experiments when he'd passed his ordeal and joined the club. Harry was extra good at maths and physics. Which makes it sort of interesting, Gary said. If our picture works by maths like those BLIT things, will Harry be able to take it for longer because his brain's built that way? Or will it be harder because it's coming on his own wavelength, sort of thing? The Shutter Club reckoned that, although of course you shouldn't do experiments on people, this was a neat idea that you could argue either side of. And they did. Thursday came, and after an eternity of history and double physics, there was a free period that you were supposed to spend reading or in computer studies. Nobody knew it would be the Shutterer's last initiation, although Julie, who read heaps of fantasy novels, insisted later that she'd felt an all doom-laden and could sense a powerful reek of wrongness. Julie tended to say things like that. The session in the musty storeroom began pretty well, with Khalid reaching his 20 seconds at last, Jonathan sailing beyond the count of 10, which only a few days ago had felt like an impossible Everest, and, to carefully muted clapping, Heather finally becoming a full member of the club. Then the trouble began, as Harry, the first-timer, adjusted his little round glasses, set his shoulders, opened the tatty ritual binder, and went rigid. Not twitchy or shuddery, but stiff. He made horrible grunts and pig squeals, and fell sideways. Blood trickled from his mouth. "He's bitten his tongue," said Heather. "Oh Lord, what's first aid for biting your tongue?" At this point, the storeroom door opened and Mr. Whitcutt came in. He looked older and sadder. I might have known it would be like this. Suddenly he turned his eyes sideways and shaded them with one hand, as though blinded by strong light. "Cover it up. Shut your eyes, Patel. Don't look at it, and just cover that damned thing up." Khalid did as he was told. They helped Harry to his feet. He kept saying, "Sorry, sorry," in a thick voice, and dribbling like a vampire with awful table manners. The long march through the uncarpeted, echoey corridors to the school's little sick room, and then onward to the principal's office, seemed to go on for endless, grim hours. Miss Fortmain, the principal, was an iron-gray woman who, according to school rumors, was kind to animals but could reduce any pupil to ashes with a few sharp sentences. A kind of human BLIT. She looked across her desk at the Shutter Club for one eternity of a moment and said sharply, "Whose idea was it?" Khalid slowly put up a brown hand, but no higher than his shoulder. Jonathan remembered the Three Musketeers motto, one for all and all for one, and said, "It was all of us, really." So Julie added, "That's right." "I really don't know," said the principal, tapping the closed ring binder that lay in front of her. "The single most insidious weapon on Earth, the information war equivalent of the neutron bomb, and you were playing with it. I don't often say that words fail me." "Someone left it in the photocopier. Here, downstairs," Khalid pointed out. "Yes, mistakes do happen." Her face softened a little. "And I'm getting carried away, because we do actually use that BLIT image as a part of a little talk I have with older children when they're about to leave school. They're exposed to it for just 2 seconds, with proper medical supervision. Its nickname is the Trembler, and some countries use big posters of it for riot control, but not Britain or America, naturally. Of course, you couldn't have known that Harry Steen is a borderline epileptic, or that the Trembler would give him a fit." "I should have guessed sooner," said Mr. Whitcutt's voice from behind the club. Young Patel blew the gaff by asking what was either a very intelligent question or a very incriminating one. But I'm an old fool who never got used to the idea of a school being a terrorist target. The principal gave him a sharp look. Jonathan suddenly felt dizzy, with thoughts clicking through his head like one of those workings in algebra where everything just goes right and you could almost see the answer waiting in the white space at the bottom of the page. What don't deep green terrorists like? Why are we a target? Control systems. You wouldn't want to be controlled. He blurted, "Biochips. We've got biochip control systems. In our heads, all us kids. They make the darkness somehow. The special dark where grown-ups can still see." There was a moment's frozen silence. "Go to the top of the class," murmured old Whitcutt. The principal sighed and seemed to sag in her chair a little. "There had to be a first time," she said quietly. "This is what my lecture to school leavers is all about. How you're specially privileged children, how you've been protected all your lives by biochips in your optic nerves that edit what you can see. So it always seems dark in the streets and outside the windows, wherever there might be a BLIT image waiting to kill you. But that kind of darkness isn't real, except to you. Remember, your parents had a choice, and they agreed to this protection." Mine didn't both agree, thought Jonathan, remembering an overheard quarrel. "It's not fair," said Gary uncertainly. "It's doing experiments on people." Khalid said, "And it's not just protection. There are corridors here indoors that are blacked out, just to keep us out of places. To control us." Ms. Fortmain chose not to hear them. Maybe she had a biochip of her own that stopped rebellious remarks from getting through. When you leave school, you are given full control over your biochips. You can choose whether to take risks, once you're old enough. Jonathan could almost bet that all 5 club members were thinking the same thing. What the hell, we took our risks with the Trembler and we got away with it. Apparently they had indeed got away with it, since when the principal said, "You can go now," she'd still mentioned nothing about punishment. As slowly as they dared, the club headed back to the classroom. Whenever they passed side turnings, which were filled with solid darkness, Jonathan cringed to think that a chip behind his eyes was stealing the light, and with different programming could make him blind to everything. Everywhere. The seriously nasty thing happened at going home time, when the caretaker unlocked the school's side door as usual while a crowd of pupils jostled behind him. Jonathan and the club had pushed their way almost to the front of the mob. The heavy wooden door swung inward. As usual, it opened on the second kind of darkness. But something bad from the dark came in with it. A large sheet of paper fixed with a drawing pin to the door's outer surface and hanging slightly askew. The caretaker glanced at it and toppled like a man struck by lightning. Jonathan didn't stop to think. He shoved past some smaller kid and grabbed the paper, crumpling it up frantically. It was already too late. He'd seen the image there, completely unlike the Trembler, yet very clearly from the same terrible family, a slanted dark shape like the profile of a perched bird, but with complications. Twirly bits, patterns like fractals, and it hung there blazing in his mind's eye and wouldn't go away. Something hard and horrible smashing like a runaway express into his brain. Burning, falling, burning, falling. BLIT. After long and evil dreams of bird shapes that stalked him in darkness, Jonathan found himself lying on a couch. No, a bed, in the school sick room. It was a surprise to be anywhere at all, after feeling his whole life crashing into that enormous full stop. He was still limp all over, too tired to do more than stare at the white ceiling. Mr. Whitcutt's face slowly came into his field of vision. "Hello? Hello? Anyone in there?" He sounded worried. "Yes, I'm fine," said Jonathan, not quite truthfully. "Thank heaven for that. Nurse Baker was amazed you were alive. Alive and sane seemed too much to hope for. Well, I'm here to warn you that you're a hero. Plucky boy saves fellow pupils. You'll be surprised how quickly you can get sick of being called plucky." What was it on the door? One of the very bad ones, called the Parrot for some reason. Poor old George, the caretaker, was dead before he hit the ground. The anti-terrorist squad came to dispose of that BLIT paper couldn't believe you'd survived. Neither could I. Jonathan smiled. I've had practice. Yes, it didn't take that long to realize Lucy, that is, Miss Fortmain, failed to ask you young hooligans enough questions. So I had another word with your friend Khalid Patel. God in heaven, that boy can outstare the Trembler for 20 seconds. Adult crowds fall over in convulsions once they've properly, registered the side of the thing, let it lock in. My record's 10.5. Nearly 11, really. The old man shook his head wonderingly. I wish I could say I didn't believe you. They'll be reassessing the whole biochip protection program. No one ever thought of training young, flexible minds to resist BLIT attack by a sort of vaccination process. If they'd thought of it, they still wouldn't dare try it. Anyway, Lucy and I had a talk, and we have a little present for you. They can reprogram those chips by radio link in no time at all, and so... He pointed. Jonathan made an effort and turned his head. Through the window, where he'd expected to only see artificial darkness, there was a complication of rosy light and glory that at first his eyes couldn't take in. A little at a time, assembling itself like some kind of healing opposite to those deadly patterns. The abstract brilliance of heaven became a town roofscape glowing in rose-red sunset. Even the chimney pots and satellite dishes looked beautiful. He'd seen sunsets on video, of course, but it wasn't the same. It was the aching difference between live flame and an electric flare's dull glare. Like so much of the adult world, the TV screen lied by what it didn't tell you. The other present is from your pals. They said they're sorry there wasn't time to get anything better. It was a small, somewhat bent bar of chocolate. Gary always had a few tucked away, with a card written in Julie's careful left-sloping script and signed by all the Shutter Club. The inscription was, of course, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. This final story does provide some more information about the world, which is fascinating, but it's honestly not that much beyond what we could have extrapolated from the first few entries. It does serve one awesome purpose, though, ending the series on a hopeful note for humanity, which is a nice little conclusion. Personally, I didn't like it nearly as much as the first and third entries, but it was nice to come full circle with the parrot. I will say I was honestly hoping for something a little bit more terrifying. I think Lanford could have dove deeper into the scary world he created instead of just throwing in the towel and lifting it out of danger and giving humanity a happy ending, but whatever. It was a great conclusion overall, and I hope you enjoyed it. I chose this story to talk about today, not just because it was an interesting series, but because those underlying connections to other universes and modern concepts in sci-fi are so awesome. I really enjoyed this series, but also sought out to tell this story to give credit to Lanford for all sorts of things, from Roko's Basilisk to SCP narratives and the general history of an internet horror theme that I had so much fun learning about. I hope, if anything, that if this video pops off a bit, it'll end up with more people trying their hand at tackling the Basilisk, whether by writing new stories or coming up with entire philosophical proposals like Roko's. Most importantly though, I hope you enjoyed the video. That's it for today's meat and potatoes, guys, so now you get to listen to my YouTuber word salad. If you enjoyed this today, it helps me when you show love to the video either by liking, subbing, or sharing, so thank you so much for that. Also, if you enjoy this content and want to be a part of the community, check out our Discord where we have some good conversations and you can help pick future videos. Also, if you're into sci-fi, I'm willing to bet you enjoy my iceberg on I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which you can check out after this video ends. For those of you who've stuck around so far, you guys are the best, and I want to let you know how much I appreciate your support and our collective achievement of hitting 50k subs, which is insane. We are over halfway to 100,000, which is just awesome. That's all for now, actually, and good night.